Hello, this is David Rutledge here with the Philosopher Zone once again. Welcome to the show. Now, if you're a good, modern, post-death of God, secular, rational human being, you might think that the universe is all matter. There's no cosmic consciousness out there, no God, no ghost in the big machine, just a lot of stuff whirling around. And if you're even more of a materialist, you might think the same thing is taking place inside our brains. No ghost in the smaller machine, no ineffable soul, just more stuff, even to the point where our very consciousness is the result of material processes taking place inside all of that grey matter. And if you do think that, then you're in very good company because there's a lot of science backing you up. Consciousness is a contested topic, but the idea that it's a neurological phenomenon through and through is a very respectable one. Well, this week I'm speaking with someone who takes something of an opposite view. He believes not only that neuroscience does not explain conscious experience, not only that there is cosmic consciousness out there in the universe, but that consciousness is animated by a kind of cosmic purpose, and that all of this is solidly grounded in science. His name is Philip Goff. He's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Durham in the UK, and he's the author of Why? The Purpose of the Universe. It's quite a read, and I'm delighted to have Philip Goff join me now. Philip, welcome to the Philosopher's Zone.
Thanks, David. It's lovely to be here. I'm looking forward to having a conversation.
Indeed. Well, look, let's begin with consciousness, for which there is famously an easy problem and a hard problem. The easy problem of consciousness refers to the challenge of explaining certain cognitive functions and how they arise from physical processes in our bodies. And the problem is deemed easy because scientists can explain these things reasonably well. But then there's the hard problem of consciousness. Can you tell us what that is?
Well, I really think this is one of the great unsolved mysteries of contemporary science and philosophy. Despite great progress on our understanding of the brain in recent decades, we still lack even the beginnings of an explanation of how the brain produces consciousness, that inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us enjoys every second of waking life. And if you look at the kind of story of the brain you get from neuroscience with neural firings and chemical sendings of signals and electrochemical goings on, none of that seems to refer to feelings or experiences. On the face of it, it seems like the whole story of the brain could go on without talking about feelings or experiences at all. So where do they come from? That's the starting point, at least, I think.
Right. Well, we had the philosopher Daniel Dennett on the program recently, and as you'll be aware, his view of the hard problem of consciousness is simply that it doesn't exist, or at least that it's a deeper inflection of the easy problem of consciousness. So consciousness, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but according to a materialist like Dennett, consciousness is 100% the result of physical processes happening within the brain, and if there are aspects of consciousness that we can't fully explain, it's because neuroscience hasn't completely unraveled the complexities of the brain. So in your view, is the problem here that this materialist perspective places a degree of faith in neuroscience that may or may not turn out to be misplaced, ultimately remains to be seen? Or do you think it's just straight up wrong?
Yeah, I've had a lot of good conversations with Daniel Dennett. I think what I like about Dennett is he's wonderfully consistent. He thinks the only things we're allowed to believe in are those we can demonstrate on the basis of experiments or scientific observations. To that extent, he is a proponent of scientism in that sense. Whereas I think that we have, in a sense, another source of information. There's something else we know to be real, namely our own feelings and experiences. If you're in pain, you're just directly aware of your pain. So feelings and experiences are not a scientific datum. It's not something we know about from experiments. I can't look in your brain and see your feelings and experiences. So it's not a scientific datum in that sense, but it's real. The felt experience of pain is real and undeniable. And so we need to accommodate it in our theory of reality. So if, like Daniel Dennett and my friend Keith Frankish, who I do my Mind Chat podcast with, they think right? The only things that are real, the only things we need to explain are what can be observed from the outside, the behavior of the organism, what can be observed about the behavior of the brain. That's it. That's all we need to explain. And yeah, if that's what you think, then there's no problem, right? It's just ongoing science. But I think that's all absolutely crucial. But we also need to explain what we know from the inside. So we've got two things here that we need to fit together. What we know about the brain from the outside through science, but what we know about consciousness from the inside by being conscious. And that's the philosophical puzzle, how those two things fit together.
Well, one really interesting aspect of your work on consciousness is that you're a proponent of panpsychism. What exactly is that?
Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes right down to the basic building blocks of reality. So fundamental particles like electrons and quarks have incredibly simple forms of experience, and the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these more rudimentary forms of experience at the level of fundamental physics. So it doesn't necessarily mean literally everything is conscious. The idea is that the basic building blocks of reality have some kind of very simple experience, but maybe not every random combination of fundamental particles is conscious. So it doesn't mean rocks and socks and tables and chairs are conscious, just that the smallest constituents of rocks and socks and tables and chairs have some kind of experience. I mean, I often talk about it in terms of particles, but many theoretical physicists are more inclined to think that the basic constituents of reality are universe-wide fields rather than fundamental particles, and particles are just local excitations in fields. So it's a job of physics to tell us what the basic constituents of reality are. The panpsychist adds to that whatever they are, those constituents, those building blocks of reality have very simple forms of conscious experience.
And is there a way of describing that conscious experience from the outside? I mean, do we have any sort of access to it? Because as you say, sure, I can't say my T-shirt is conscious in any way that makes sense. But if atoms, electrons, these very small particles have a kind of consciousness, the flippant way to think about it would be, well, they're sort of zooming around thinking this is a nice day, I'm feeling a bit bored, whatever. Of course, we're not talking about that kind of consciousness, but what sort of consciousness are we talking about? Because we're talking about subjective experience then, aren't we?
Yeah, it's an important qualification. People get the idea that panpsychists are saying quarks are sitting there thinking, wondering if it's Tuesday or feeling existential angst or something. But the consciousness of a human being is incredibly rich and complex, the result of millions of years of evolution. But consciousness comes in all shapes and sizes. The consciousness of a sheep is much simpler. The consciousness of a snail is simpler still. As we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of experience. So the claim of the panpsychist is this keeps going down, right down to the basic building blocks of matter, with electrons and quarks or maybe fields having incredibly simple forms of experience. So yeah, I mean, actually physical science, for all its richness, is really just a story about what stuff does. Physics doesn't tell us what an electron is. It just tells us what it does. It gives us mathematical equations that tell us quite precisely how it's going to behave. So really, there's in a sense a hole in our standard scientific story of matter. Physics is just telling us what stuff does, not what it is. As Stephen Hawking said, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. So essentially, the panpsychist puts consciousness in that hole. It's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations.
Right. So how does panpsychism then relate to the hard problem of consciousness, this riddle of how and why we have a subjective experience? Does it reframe the problem in some sort of interesting way? Does it point to a solution?
Actually, to be honest, I tend not to use the word hard problem of consciousness anymore. It's been a very useful phrase, but I think it often brings to people's mind the idea that this is just a purely scientific problem and we just need to do more experiments and we'll crack it. But I think what's at the core here is a philosophical problem, the ancient challenge that philosophers refer to as the mind-body problem. The challenge of how consciousness and the physical world fit together. And there are various options. Maybe the physical world is fundamental and consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain. That's the physicalist or materialist position of Daniel Dennett, for example, and many others. The panpsychist turns that on its head, right? For the panpsychist, it's consciousness that's fundamental and physical reality emerges from more fundamental facts about consciousness. So you've got two explanatory projects trying to get consciousness out of physical science. That's gone nowhere, of dubious coherence. The other project is trying to get physical reality out of consciousness. And that's, in fact, in a sense, an already completed project. So in my mind, it's kind of a no-brainer, which is the more plausible option here.
A completed project in what sense, though? I mean, how has philosophy cracked the code to get physical matter out of consciousness or physical reality out of consciousness?
So this is where we come to the influence of very important work from Bertrand Russell in the 1920s. I think we should think of Russell as the Darwin of consciousness. I think he essentially solved all the mysteries here. And his work was somewhat neglected for a long time, but in the last 10 or 15 years, it's been kind of rediscovered. And this has resulted in panpsychism going from a view that's laughed at insofar as it's thought of at all to being a credible, still minority, but a credible option that's published on and taught to our undergraduates. So in the 1920s, I think Russell was thinking really hard about the fact that our basic science is just pure mathematics. And that's something you kind of take for granted. And it's something that's really useful if you're a scientist because you can express your predictions very precisely. But what does it mean as a philosopher interested in the fundamental nature of reality, that our basic science, our fundamental science is just equations? And what Russell realized it means is that actually physics isn't telling us that much about the nature of fundamental reality. It's merely describing its mathematical structure. So as far as physics is concerned, fundamental reality could turn out to be anything. As long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to be able to get physics out of that. So the panpsychist exploits this to make sense of their view. So the idea is what we have at the fundamental level of reality is networks of very simple conscious entities behaving in very simple, predictable ways. Through their interactions, they realize certain patterns, certain mathematical structures. And then the claim is those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. So in this way, we get physics out of underlying facts about consciousness. So you can't get, I would argue, you can't get consciousness out of physics, but you can get physics out of consciousness. We know that can be done. The view sounds a bit weird, but it delivers the goods, and that's what's important at the end of the day.
In your book, you go further than arguing for the universal existence of what we might call raw consciousness, just a sort of capacity for registering subjective experience. You make the leap into purpose. And how do we get there from the existence of universal consciousness to the existence of purposeful universal consciousness, cosmic purpose?
So this is the most challenging part of the book. I think there's an underexplored difficulty making sense of how and why consciousness evolved. Natural selection is just interested in behavior, right? Because it's only behavior that matters for survival. And with the rapid recent progress in AI and robotics, it's become apparent that you can have incredibly complex information processing, incredibly complex behavior with no kind of inner life or experience at all. And therefore, it seems conceivable that natural selection might have made what we might call survival mechanisms, very complicated mechanisms that mechanically track features of their environment and initiate very complex behaviors that are conducive to survival, but which have no kind of inner life or experience at all. Maybe like the Terminator. I don't know. Is the Terminator conscious? I don't know. Some complicated mechanism that's very good at survival, very good at catching its prey, but has no inner life at all. And so now the question is, why did natural selection make us with inner conscious experience and understanding of the world rather than just complicated survival mechanisms? So I think this is a very, very deep challenge. And there are a couple of steps in the argument here, but where I ultimately end up, the hypothesis for addressing this challenge is what I call panagentialism, which is the view that not just consciousness, but the roots of human agency go right down to the fundamental building blocks of reality. So on the panagentialist view, matter is rational stuff. All the way down to particles, we have things that have some kind of experience and are rationally responding on the basis of their experience. So sounds very, very odd, even more odd than panpsychism. But the attraction of it is, for me, is that once you've got that panagentialist view in place, now all you need is natural selection. So I do think consciousness evolved, but I think we need something like this picture in place to make sense of the fact that consciousness evolved. So once you've got this panagentialist view that all matter rationally responds to the character of its experience, now natural selection has a motivation to give us conscious understanding of the world around us. Because if we have conscious understanding of the world around us, and we can rationally respond, freely respond on the basis of that experience, then we're going to survive very well. So my bet is that creatures with conscious understanding of the environment around them and the ability to freely, rationally respond on that basis are much better at surviving than very, very complex mechanisms that are just sort of mechanically interacting with the world. That conscious understanding opens up radically new possibilities for behavior that are much more conducive to survival than mere mechanical interacting. So that's the claim.
So you're talking about a purposeful consciousness that everything in the cosmos has, rather than a single purposeful consciousness sort of behind what happens, if you know what I mean. I guess I'm talking about a sort of a God figure, an intelligent designer, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I guess in contemporary society, when we think of purpose, we think of a cosmic designer who set things going, maybe keeps an eye on it. And we contrast that with just a totally meaningless, purposeless universe governed by impersonal mathematical laws. There's a kind of rigid dichotomy here. It's like, whose side are you on, Richard Dawkins or the Pope? But there are lots of possibilities in between. And the philosopher Aristotle had a picture of the world in which things were driven by purposes. Fire had the purpose of getting to the heavens. Matter had the purpose of going downwards to the center of the universe. Human animals had the purpose of rationality. But for Aristotle, these weren't purposes imposed by an external creator. They were just built into the structure of reality. So, of course, we know Aristotle's picture of the universe was wrong in all sorts of ways. Nonetheless, I think it's a coherent philosophical scientific possibility that even basic matter is somewhat purposive, if that is a word, in being aimed at rational appropriateness of responding rationally in relation to its experience of reality. So obviously that's very complicated in the human brain and in many complex animals, but I think we can make sense of a very kind of crude proto-agency going on even at the level of fundamental physics. Obviously there are a lot of details to be, I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed that I try to work out in the book, but that's the general project.
One of the ideas that you work out in your book that I find really elegant has to do with the way that we think about the laws of nature. Like once upon a time, we thought laws of nature were there because God had put them in place. And while today science has taken God out of the picture, we still have no problem with referring to laws of nature as such. We don't get hung up on the notion that laws of nature require a lawgiver. And so you apply this reasoning to cosmic purpose. You suggest that we might just as reasonably talk about cosmic purpose without that purpose having to represent the will of a divine agent of some sort. I really like that. Can you say a little bit more about that?
So I survey a number of proposals for accounting for cosmic purpose in the absence of the traditional God of Western religion. As you say, one of these options is an option that's been developed by the philosopher Thomas Nagel in his book Mind and Cosmos. He talks about teleological laws, laws of nature with purposes built into them. So there might just be a basic drive in the universe towards the emergence of life or the emergence of conscious understanding without there being some kind of conscious mind to undergird that purpose. And such drives might interact with the more familiar laws of physics in ways we don't yet understand. So yeah, that seems to me at least a coherent possibility. It's not one I definitely settle on absolutely, but it seems to me a coherent option.
I like to think of David Hume's famous skepticism regarding causation. You know, you're playing tennis, you hit the ball with your racket and it flies over the net. And while we like to think that the racket caused the ball to move, we don't actually observe a causal chain of events. All we see is the racket hitting the ball and then the ball moving. It's like there's an explanatory gap between what we observe and what we want to interpret as a causal relationship. So would you then perhaps be filling that gap with purposeful consciousness? Like you'd argue that at some level, the racket and the ball are following some very rudimentary form of conscious inclination.
Good. I wouldn't say quite that I'm solving Hume's problem, but I think it's relevant. What Hume is pointing to is another kind of gap in our scientific story of reality. I think Hume correctly observed that science tells us how things behave, what they do, but it doesn't tell us why they behave in that way. It's a little bit like Newton was famously asked. Newton gave this equation of gravitational attraction, and people said, well, hold on, why? Why are things attracted to each other by this force proportional to the mass and the distance between them? And Newton famously said, now I can't remember the Latin now, but he said, I don't frame hypotheses. You know, it's my job as a scientist to give mathematical laws, but not to say why things behave in accordance with those mathematical laws. Now, most philosophers, or many philosophers, postulate impersonal causal powers, causal capacities to account for the regular behavior we find in the universe. But I would argue it's equally consistent with observation to postulate that what we're actually observing is not things being compelled to behave by prior causes, but things rationally responding on the basis of their experience of reality. So you might say, well, hold on, if particles aren't being compelled to behave, how come they end up behaving so predictably? And then the thought is, well, what's going on is particles at earlier times are not compelling particles at later times to behave, but they set up conscious inclinations in particles at later times. What do I mean by conscious inclination? I mean a very, very simple form of what you feel when you're hungry, you're tired, or you yearn for something. So particles have very, very simple forms of desire or craving, if you like. Now, if you're a mature human being and you crave something, you can rationally deliberate. You can think, is it a good idea? Maybe I don't want to eat the chocolate. Maybe I don't want to lash out and hit this person. But particles, of course, are not able to rationally deliberate. They don't really have any understanding of the world. So my claim is they're pretty much inevitably going to just respond to their inclinations. They're going to do what they feel like doing. I think that is a kind of rational response. It is rational to do what you feel like doing, all things being equal. It's in a way the simplest kind of rational response. And particles, because they can't rationally deliberate, are incapable of some more sophisticated rational response. So they inevitably resort to just the simplest rational response. Do what you feel like. And so we get a predictable, regular world. I first was thinking about this raising young children, actually, because young children, if the child wants the chocolate and it can get it, the child's going to go and get it, right? Because they can't rationally deliberate. So they just do what they feel like doing. So the idea is particles are like, kind of like kids, but very, very simple forms of proto-rational agency, if you like.
What I find really interesting about your book is that this is not New Age mysticism. I mean, your claim is that the case for cosmic consciousness, cosmic purpose, rests on solidly scientific foundations, and it's very technical and complex in the book. We don't need to sort of go into the details, but what you're saying is that the laws of physics are so fine-tuned and the numbers are so compelling that you just have to draw this conclusion. But my question is, if the numbers are so compelling, why aren't more scientists on board with this?
Good question. So, the first thing to say is, I don't think the physics itself is especially controversial, especially things like perhaps the example that's most baffled physicists, which revolves around what we call dark energy, the force that powers the expansion of the universe. In 1998, we discovered that the universe is not only expanding, but accelerating in its expansion. And scientists postulate a force that's pushing things apart, which we call dark energy. And once you do the calculations, it becomes clear that if that force had been a little bit stronger, everything would have shot apart so quickly that no two particles would have ever met. We would have no stars, no planets, no structural complexity whatsoever, and therefore no life. Whereas if that force had been a little bit weaker, it wouldn't have counteracted gravity and everything would have collapsed in the first split second of the Big Bang. Again, no stars, planets, life. So for life to be possible, the strength of this force had to be like Goldilocks porridge, just right, not too strong, not too weak. So that's pretty uncontroversial. There are many, that's just one example. There are many such numbers, and you might find scientists disputing some of it, agreeing with some, but it's not like this is a fringe view. As a non-physicist, I wouldn't be writing a book defending a fringe view in science because I don't have the skill set to do that. But you're right. What is more controversial is the evidential implications of this science. So, to my mind, we face a simple dilemma, right? Either it's just incredible, unbelievable fluke that the numbers in physics happen to be right for life. And I think it's just too improbable to take seriously. Or the numbers in our physics are as they are because they are the right numbers for life. In other words, that there is some kind of goal-directedness towards life at the fundamental level of reality. So I think the evidence of fine-tuning does point to something like cosmic purpose, cosmic goal-directedness. Now, coming head on to your question, why don't more people accept this? To be honest, I think it's cultural reasons. It doesn't fit with the picture of science we've got used to in the last century. I think it's a little bit like in the 16th century, we started getting evidence that we weren't in the center of the universe, and people struggled to accept that because it didn't fit with the picture of reality they'd got used to. And nowadays we scoff at those people and we think, oh, those stupid religious people, why couldn't they just follow the evidence? But every generation absorbs a worldview it struggles to see beyond. And, you feel silly if you counter it. I feel silly. I don't feel comfortable talking about cosmic purpose. I feel silly standing up in front of my peers and talking about cosmic purpose. I'm sure people defending the Copernican view in the 16th century felt silly and got mocked. But I like to quote the economist Keynes, where a journalist once said to him, "You didn't used to believe that." And he said, "Well, when the facts change, I change my views. What do you do, sir?" But I think that's so hard for human beings to do. We get stuck in these ways of thinking. And yeah, I think future historians will look back and think it's bizarre that we didn't follow through the implications of the fine-tuning of physics.
So, Philip, what significance does the purpose of the universe have for human existence, if any? Like, how could our understanding of cosmic purpose perhaps affect our actions as individuals and as communities, particularly when it comes to moral decision making? Is there some sort of connection there?
Most of my book is just making the cold-blooded scientific philosophical case for cosmic purpose, regardless of whether you care about it. You could accept most of my book and say, okay, one of my colleagues, David Rutledge, says, yeah, I think you've got a pretty good case there. I don't care about cosmic purpose. I get on with my life, make my own meaning. But of course, it is interesting to think about possible implications for human meaning and purpose. And that's what I do in the first and last chapters of the book. And I take here a kind of middle way between two familiar points of view. At one extreme, the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig says that if there's no point to the universe, then everything's pointless. Life is meaningless. He even says we might as well just kill each other. Not only religious philosophers, the anti-natalist philosopher David Benatar thinks life is so pointless that the moral thing to do is to let the human race pass out of existence. He actually thinks it's immoral to have children. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is a familiar humanist position that my colleague David Rutledge exemplifies, that, if there's cosmic purpose, it's just irrelevant. We make our own meaning. So I have a sort of middle way that I think we can have perfectly meaningful lives, regardless of cosmic purpose. If we live lives of pursuing kindness, knowledge, creativity, and so on, then, your life can be very meaningful. But if there is cosmic purpose, then perhaps there's the potential for human life to be more meaningful. I think ultimately we want our lives to make a difference. And if potentially one can contribute in some small way to the purposes of the whole of reality, that's about as big a difference as you can imagine making. So yes, we can have meaning without cosmic purpose, but there's the potential for much greater meaning if there is cosmic purpose. But it's important to say I'm not trying to ground morality and value in cosmic purpose. I think if we tried to do that, that would get us into the famous Euthyphro dilemma that we find in Plato's dialogues, which people often use to challenge attempts to ground morality in the commands of God. So the classic example is, well, suppose we say murder is bad. Now, did God command us not to murder because murder is bad? Or is murder bad because God commanded us not to murder? Either of those seems problematic. So if God commanded us to murder because it's bad, well, that makes the badness of murder independent of God. So it's got nothing to do with God. But if murder is bad just because God commanded us not to kill people, well, that seems like, well, God could have commanded something else. God could have commanded us to kill people, and then that would have been good. It seems to make morality rather arbitrary. I think you get into similar issues if you try to ground morality in cosmic purpose. You can follow through that reasoning for yourself. So I am actually a value objectivist. This is something else I talk about in the book. I do think there are objective facts about what is worth doing and what is not worth doing. I think pursuing power for its own sake, that a certain former recent prime minister of ours was rather partial to, I think, not mentioning any names. Pursuing power for its own sake, I think, is a pointless activity, objectively stupid, pointless activity. Whereas pursuing scientific understanding, pursuing the welfare of humanity and other animals on this planet, just pursuing pleasure for yourself and your family, these are all worth doing. So I do think there is meaning, there is value, there is purpose independently of cosmic purpose. And also in this book, I'm not here to say, oh, this is definitely the only right way to live your life. But I suppose I'm interested in opening up other options that people might not have thought of that are between the two familiar options of traditional religion or secular atheism, and I have come in the last 5 years or so to find what we might call cosmic purposivism, a meaningful way of living life, to see value and meaning in your activities and your own life and that of your family and loved ones, but connecting that in some way to a hope of a greater purpose that all fits into. I have found that to be a meaningful way of living life. Keeps my ego in check a little bit. Maybe it's not the only way of leading a meaningful life, but it's at least an option that I'd like people to consider.
That's a nice note to end on. Philip Goff, Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Durham University. Your book is Why? The Purpose of the Universe. It's a marvellous book. I've really enjoyed talking about it with you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot, David. That was a lot of fun. That was a really great in-depth conversation.